You're standing in a converted mansion on the outskirts of Kiev in late 1950, and in front of you sits a machine that shouldn't exist, according to everything the American government thought it knew. The MESM, short for Meshchonnaya, Elektronnaya, Schyotna, Mashina, fills an entire room with its cabinet frames and vacuum tubes glowing soft orange in the darkness. I'm Jacob, and what I want to show you is how this moment, this exact machine, was erased from Western technological history for years, not because it was secret, but because nobody was paying attention. Let's start with the physical thing itself, because that's where the shock lives. Sergei Lebedev was a Soviet electrical engineer who understood that computing wasn't theoretical anymore. It was material. It was tubes and wires and the careful management of electrical pulses. In 1950, after years of rebuilding Kiev's infrastructure following the devastation of World War II, Lebedev and his team completed the MESM. It weighed roughly 4 tons. It consumed about 14 kilowatts of electrical power, which meant that during its operation, the entire room would warm noticeably. The machine used approximately 6,000 vacuum tubes, arranged in a logic that could perform about 3,000 floating point operations per second. To put that in context, that was genuinely fast for the time. The cabinet itself was constructed from metal frames and housed the tubes in organized rows, with separate units for the power supply, the control systems, and the memory unit. The memory used what was called mercury delay lines, a technology where data was stored as acoustic pulses traveling through tubes of mercury. It sounds strange now, but it worked. The MESM could perform addition in about 200 microseconds. Multiplication took about 3,000. When Lebedev's team first powered it on and ran their test calculations, they were not demonstrating a prototype or a curiosity. They were demonstrating a genuinely operational electronic computer, and it was in the Soviet Union. The story of why nobody in America or Western Europe realized what had happened requires understanding the state of computing knowledge in 1950. ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, had been completed in the United States in 1945 and was widely known in academic circles. It was enormous, used nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes, and was treated as a marvel of American engineering. UNIVAC, the first commercial computer, wasn't delivered until 1951, so the timeline actually matters here. The MESM was completed before UNIVAC. It was operational, tested, and proven to work. And yet, the Western computing community simply did not know. Part of this was deliberate. Soviet research was compartmentalized. Lebedev's work at the Institute of Electrotechnology in Kiev was not widely publicized within the Soviet system itself, let alone internationally. The Soviet Union was not in the business of broadcasting its technological achievements to potential enemies during the height of the Cold War. But part of it was also structural ignorance. American computer scientists and engineers were not reading Soviet technical journals with regularity. The barrier of language was one issue. The barrier of political mistrust was another. There was an assumption that if the Soviets had accomplished something significant in computing, word would somehow reach Western intelligence agencies. It did not, or if it did, it was not believed. The MESM remained largely unknown to the American computing world, not through secrecy, but through a kind of technological silence that emerged naturally from geopolitical isolation. What makes this story stranger as it unfolds is that the MESM wasn't just a working computer, it was systematically used. Starting in 1951, Lebedev's team ran real calculations on the machine. They solved complex mathematical problems related to neutron diffusion, which had direct applications to Soviet nuclear physics research. They performed aerodynamic calculations for aircraft design. The machine operated continuously for 6 years, from 1950 until 1956. During that time, it performed thousands of hours of computational work, proving that electronic computing at scale was not an American monopoly. In 1952, Lebedev designed and oversaw the construction of an even more advanced machine, the MESM-2, which featured improved memory capacity and faster operation. By 1953, there were other computing machines under development in the Soviet Union. The Institute of Precise Mechanics and Computing Technology in Moscow was working on its own systems. Yet still, the Western world did not fully grasp the scope of Soviet computing development. American military strategists were focused on nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. The idea that the Soviet Union might have computational advantages in specific domains was not part of the mainstream conversation. Universities in America were slowly acquiring computers, treating them as research tools for elite institutions. The assumption was that America's technological superiority was assured, particularly in electronics and computation. The MESM proved that assumption wrong, but the proof existed only in Soviet technical publications and internal reports that rarely circulated beyond the Iron Curtain. It took years, sometimes decades, before Western historians and engineers would fully acknowledge what Lebedev had accomplished in that converted mansion in Kiev. The moment that brings this all into focus happened in the late 1950s. Western computing specialists were finally beginning to learn about Lebedev's work through indirect channels and occasional publications that escaped Soviet technical repositories. But by then, the narrative had already calcified. ENIAC was in the history books as the first electronic digital computer in the world. UNIVAC was celebrated as the first commercial machine. American engineers and institutions received credit for pioneering the field. Lebedev's name appeared in some specialized publications, but the MESM itself remained peripheral to the standard account of computing history. Part of the reason was practical. The machine itself no longer existed in its original form by the time Western scholars were seriously examining Soviet computing achievements. Lebedev moved on to other projects and designs. The hardware was repurposed or abandoned. There were no photographs widely circulated in the Western press. There were no American engineers who had visited the site to vouch for what they had seen. The evidence was documentary, technical, and mediated through language and translation. As the 1960s arrived and computing technology evolved rapidly, the question of who built what first seemed less urgent than the question of who was building better machines now. But the erasure was real. Lebedev was a brilliant engineer who made a genuine contribution to the history of computing, and that contribution was largely invisible to the discipline that benefited from it. He died in 1974, still working on computing machines in the Soviet Union, still largely unknown in the West. His work was reclaimed gradually by historians interested in Soviet science. But by then, the canonical story of computing's origins had already been written, and it did not include him. What you've just witnessed is how a major technological achievement can disappear not through destruction or suppression, but through simple disconnection. Lebedev solved the problem of electronic computing independently, demonstrated that it worked, and then was forgotten by half the world. But the Soviet computing program didn't stop there. In fact, the path from the MESM led to something even more ambitious. In the next video, we're going to follow Lebedev's successor machines in the Soviet push to build the largest and fastest computer in the world during the 1960s. A project that involves some of the most creative engineering solutions you'll ever see. Stay with me for that.